What if the man you ignored, the one you laughed at, the one you never saw as equal, turned out to be the very mirror reflecting your deepest shame? Elijah Carter, a quiet janitor in a towering glass empire, spends his nights scrubbing marble floors that echo with the footsteps of men who never once said his name. But when arrogance blinds power, fate rips the mask away. A single collapse, a single moment of truth. And suddenly, the world sees not just who Elijah is, but who they truly are. The marble floors gleamed like frozen rivers beneath the fluorescent glow, each tile catching the faint reflection of the night. Elijah Carter's mop slid across them with a rhythm that was almost ritual, steady, patient, deliberate. He had been doing this for so long that the building seemed to know his touch, to recognize the silent man who polished its skin when no one else was watching. From the 27th floor, the city stretched out beyond glass walls. A universe of neon lights blinking in the darkness. Towers stabbed the sky, traffic hummed like a restless ocean below, and somewhere out there, people dreamed in warmth, while Elijah's hands ached from work that never ended. The mop handle left calluses that no one would ever notice, just like the man himself. He paused, resting his back against the edge of the wall, his reflection faint in the glass. In the silence, he thought of her. Lillian. His wife's laughter had once been the music that filled nights like this. She used to say, "One day, Eli, people will see you for more than the mop you carry. They'll see the man I married, the man who carries hope even in silence." That voice had faded years ago, leaving only memory. But he still whispered back to her sometimes, as if she were here, leaning against him, watching the lights of the city. "I'm still here, Lil," he murmured under his breath, almost ashamed of this. Words. Still fighting, still invisible. The boardroom door stood just down the hall, tall, gleaming, and locked as if it guarded the secrets of kings. He had walked past it thousands of times, and every time he felt the same burn inside his chest. He'd seen the men who entered, polished shoes, expensive watches, voices that carried as if the world bent for them. He had heard their laughter echo out into the hall, laughter that spoke of power and cruelty in equal measure. And he remembered every time the door closed just before he arrived, like a barrier designed to remind him of his place. The place of the janitor. Elijah had not always been silent. There was a time when he had believed in fairness, in the promise that if he worked hard enough, life would give back. He remembered being 20, fresh out of high school, hands strong, voice loud. He had dreams of becoming a teacher, of guiding children who looked like him toward futures brighter than his own. But then his father fell ill. The bills arrived like unending waves, each one heavier than the last. He took the night job, telling himself it would be temporary. Temporary stretched into 27 years. Now he was a man of 50, the weight of sacrifice etched into every line of his face. His son, Marcus, hardly called anymore. They spoke through texts, short, clipped messages that never held the warmth Elijah longed for. Somewhere along the way, Marcus stopped asking about his dreams. Maybe because he thought his father had none left. Maybe because Elijah had let the silence swallow him. Thunder rolled in the distance, faint but growing. The storm outside mirrored the storm he kept inside. Unspoken anger, swallowed pride, the ache of being unseen. As Elijah moved closer to the boardroom, mop in hand, he felt it again, that familiar sting. He slowed, his eyes locking on the frosted glass panel of the door. Shadows moved inside, figures gesturing, hands slicing the air as they argued over money, futures, decisions that would ripple through thousands of lives. He would never be invited in. The mop bucket's wheels squeaked against the marble. Elijah froze, fearing they might hear him. A ridiculous thought, as if they would ever notice him. Still, He held his breath, his body tense in the dim light. Inside, laughter erupted, harsh, sharp. Someone made a joke and the sound stabbed through the glass like shards. Elijah's jaw tightened. He turned away, pressing the mop to the floor again, his strokes harder now, angrier. But beneath that anger was a deeper wound. Loneliness. A loneliness so vast it filled every corridor, every silent hour. Sometimes he wondered if he had become part of the building itself, another piece of furniture to be ignored, another shadow crawling across marble. Tonight, though, felt different. The storm outside swelled louder, rain beginning to tap against the glass with impatient fingers. Elijah glanced toward the door once more, and for the briefest second he thought he saw his own reflection staring back from the glass panel, older, tired, but unbroken. And then, from inside the boardroom, he heard his name. Spoken not with respect, not with recognition, but with mockery. His grip on the mop tightened until his knuckles whitened. The storm was no longer just outside. The sound of his name hung in the air like a cruel echo. Elijah froze, his chest tightening, the mop dripping water onto the floor. He leaned closer, careful not to be seen, his ear tilted toward the frosted glass. "Carter," a voice sneered from within. "Man's been here longer than the furniture. Maybe we should make him part of the decor, put him in a frame." Laughter erupted, jagged and merciless. Another voice joined in, deeper, mocking. "Nah, he'd just clean the frame every night." More laughter, louder this time, overlapping like thunder. Elijah felt heat rise in his chest, spreading to his throat. His body trembled with a rage he had trained him, self to bury. For years he had taught his heart silence, swallowing words that might have carved scars if spoken aloud. But tonight, as rain streaked the windows and thunder growled closer, silence felt like suffocation. He gripped the mop handle tighter, pressing his forehead against the cool wall beside the boardroom. His reflection glared back at him faintly, distorted by the polished surface. Was this what he had become? A man reduced to whispers and shadows, mocked by those who had never carried even a fraction of his burdens? He thought of Marcus again, his son. When Marcus was a boy, Elijah had promised him that dignity mattered more than money, that a man's worth was measured not in titles but in character. Yet here he was, standing outside a room where men with titles laughed at his existence, erasing every promise he once believed. Elijah turned sharply, forcing himself down the hall. The squeak of the bucket's wheels followed, a pitiful sound swallowed by the storm outside. His heart hammered, each beat a reminder of his powerlessness. He wanted to shout, to slam open that boardroom door and tell them his story. But what good were stories to men who counted only dollars and deals? He stopped near the elevators, leaning against his mop. His breathing was shallow, his mind spiraling. He remembered nights when Lillian would tell him he was more than this, that one day his silence would roar louder than their laughter. You don't need their table to have a voice, Eli. The truth doesn't ask permission. But the truth felt far away now. Lightning flashed beyond the glass walls, illuminating his face for a fleeting second. The deep lines of exhaustion, the hollows carved by years of grief. For that brief moment, Elijah looked almost ghostly, as if he were part of the storm itself. A door creaked open down the hall, not the boardroom, but the office beside. It. A young assistant hurried out, papers clutched to her chest. She barely glanced at Elijah as she passed, muttering to herself about deadlines. The elevator dinged, swallowing her whole, leaving him in silence again. Elijah moved back toward his cart, his eyes drawn once more to the boardroom. He couldn't help himself, his ears strained, catching fragments of conversation between the bursts of laughter. Words like merger, profits, and cutbacks floated through the door, cold and sharp. Each word was a reminder of how the lives of thousands could shift because of decisions made behind walls that excluded men like him. The storm lashed harder now, rain pounding against the glass like fists demanding entry. Elijah imagined the building itself shuddering, as though the world outside refused to ignore the arrogance contained within those walls. He whispered again, but not to Lillian this time. "God, just once. Let me be more than invisible." His voice cracked on the last word. The mop handle slipped in his sweaty grip, clattering against the marble. The sound was louder than he expected, a sharp knock against silence. For a heartbeat, he feared the boardroom would open, that those men would step out and see him standing there, exposed. But no one came. The laughter inside drowned everything else. Elijah crouched to pick up the mop, his hands trembling. He stared at the puddle it had left, a distorted reflection of himself rippling in the water. His face looked fractured, broken into pieces that no longer aligned. Another flash of lightning lit the hall, and in that flash, Elijah made a quiet vow to himself. He was done letting them erase him. He did not know how, and he did not know when, but the silence that had defined his life would not last forever. For now, though, he turned back to his cart, resuming the familiar rhythm of his work. The mop swayed side to side across marble, erasing footprints that did not belong to him, absorbing dirt from men who never looked down. Yet as he worked, the storm built higher, angrier. The night itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable break. And just as Elijah dipped the mop again, he heard the sudden scrape of a chair inside the boardroom, followed by the booming voice of Richard Holloway himself, a voice so sharp it cut through the door like a blade. "Elijah Carter! That janitor again! God, somebody keep him out of my boardroom!" The words weren't meant for him to hear. But he did. And they sank into his chest like a brand, searing deeper than any wound. The boardroom roared with laughter at Richard Holloway's words, a cruel orchestra that drowned out even the thunder outside. Elijah stood frozen in the hallway, the mop still in his hands, but it felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of every insult he had endured. He could feel his pulse in his ears, a steady drumbeat of shame and fury. Richard Holloway, the man who sat at the head of that table, the one whose name graced the building in polished brass letters outside, had spoken of him as if he were less than a man, less than a shadow. Not Elijah, not Carter, just that janitor. Elijah pressed his lips together so tightly they trembled. The storm outside cracked with a flash so bright it threw his silhouette onto the marble, a tall, weary shadow stretching toward the very door that had excluded him. For the briefest moment, it looked as though his shadow had entered the room, even if he could not. He turned away before they could say more. The hurt burned too deeply. He pushed the mop bucket down the hall, each squeak of the wheels louder now, almost accusatory, as though reminding him of his place. The corridor felt endless, a tunnel of polished stone and indifferent light. But inside Elijah's chest, something shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was there, a flicker, small and fragile, like a match struck in the dark. He remembered the way Lillian used to look at him when he came home from night shifts. Even when exhaustion clung to him like a second skin, she would lift his chin, look him in the eye, and remind him, "You are more than what they see." Tonight, for the first time in years, he wondered if he could believe her. Elijah paused at the end of the hall, looking back once more at the boardroom door. Through the frosted glass he could see faint silhouettes, men with power, men who had just reduced him to a punchline. He thought of how many times that same door had shut in his face, how many years he had walked past it with his head bowed. Lightning lit the sky again, and this time Elijah did not flinch. His eyes narrowed. The storm seemed to be calling to him, demanding that he rise. He closed his eyes, and in the silence between thunderclaps, he made another vow. This one louder, steadier, carved into his very bones. Someday, They will see me. Not the mop. Not the uniform. Me. The thought was terrifying. The thought was impossible. And yet it was the only thing that kept him from shattering completely. Elijah turned back to his cart, wringing out the mop with trembling hands. The water sloshed violently, as if sharing his anger. He resumed cleaning the corridor, each stroke harsher than before, as though he were scrubbing away their laughter, their words, their power over him. But even as he worked, the sound of his name, mocked, dismissed, clung to him. It would not leave. It followed him into every corner of the hall, into every memory he tried to bury. When the clock struck midnight, Elijah finally wheeled his cart back toward the janitor's closet. He stored the mop, shut the door, and leaned against it, his chest heaving. He stared down at his calloused hands, the skin cracked from years of chemicals and labor. Hands that built nothing, owned nothing, but had carried everything. For the first time in a long time, Elijah allowed himself to cry, the silent tears, the kind no one would ever see, sliding down the lines of his face. He buried his face in his hands, muffling the sound, as if even his grief was not permitted to echo in this place. When he finally straightened, his eyes were red, but sharper. Something inside him had been stirred, though he could not yet name it. The storm outside raged harder, winds howling against the glass, rain battering the city like a war drum. It was as though the world itself was shifting, preparing. Elijah wiped his face with his sleeve, steadying himself. He whispered into the empty closet, not to Lillian, not to God, but to himself. Enough. The word was quiet, but it lingered in the air like smoke, refusing to vanish. He stepped back into the corridor, the marble gleaming beneath the harsh lights. For now, he was still the janitor, still invisible, still mocked. But storms do not rage forever, without breaking something open. And Elijah Carter could feel it. Something was coming. Something that would drag his name, his story, and his silence into the light. The morning sun spilled over the glass tower like liquid gold, painting its edges in brilliance. The storm had passed, leaving the city washed and glistening, as though the world itself had been scoured clean. But inside, the air was still heavy, thick with the residue of last night's cruelty. Elijah Carter wheeled his cart down the corridor once more, the rhythm of his mop a quiet heartbeat in the echoing silence. He had not slept. His eyes were rimmed with fatigue, his body aching with a weight no rest could lift. All night he had lain awake, replaying their laughter, Richard Holloway's voice slashing through him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that boardroom door, a wall between him and the world that had defined him as lesser. But duty was duty. Bills didn't vanish. Dreams didn't feed a man, so Elijah returned, just as he had for 27 years, his steps measured, his face unreadable. The boardroom loomed ahead again, the morning light filtering through its frosted glass. Inside, the shadows were fewer, more focused. This was not the laughter of the night, but the tense hum of business, of strategies drawn on whiteboards and futures dissected on spreadsheets. Elijah slowed, his body instinctively cautious, his heart still raw from the sting of last night. His hand brushed the doorframe. He told himself it was nothing, that he would move on. But fate is cruel in its timing. A secretary brushed past him, balancing a tray of coffee and papers. In her haste, a cup toppled, spilling dark liquid across the polished floor. She gasped, her face flushing red. I'm sorry, Mr. Holloway," she stammered as she hurried inside. Richard Holloway's voice thundered from within. "For God's sake, someone clean this up!" The words lashed out, impatient, commanding. And before Elijah could stop himself, before caution could drag him back, his body moved. He pushed the door open just a fraction, mop in hand, stepping into the room he had been kept from for decades. The air shifted instantly. Dozens of eyes lifted from their papers, their laptops, their cups of coffee. The silence was sharp, cutting deeper than sound. Elijah felt their stares like needles against his skin. And then came Richard Holloway. The CEO sat at the head of the long oak table, a man carved of arrogance and wealth. His hair was slicked back with precision, his suit sharp enough to cut glass. His eyes, cold, grey, merciless, locked onto Elijah like a hawk spotting prey. For a long moment, nothing moved. Elijah bent his head, lowering his mop toward the spill, pretending the silence didn't crush him. He could feel his heart hammering, each beat echoing in his ears. Then Richard spoke. "Well, well, if it isn't the Shadow himself," Richard drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet our company mascot, the mop in human form." Laughter rippled through the room. Controlled, professional laughter, but cruel all the same. Executives smirked into their cups, some trying to hide it, others not bothering. Elijah froze, his hand trembling on the mop handle. He wanted to vanish. He wanted to scream. Richard wasn't finished. "Tell me, Carter, do you think you belong here? Do you think this is your stage? These seats are not for men who scrub floors. These seats are for men who build empires." The room waited, expectant, as though Elijah's silence was the punchline. He swallowed hard, the words locked in his throat. His chest burned with all the truths he could never say. That he had built empires too, brick by brick. Only they called it survival. That his hands had carried a family. His back had carried a city that thrived on invisible labor. That without him, the marble they sat upon would be nothing but filth. But all that emerged was silence. Richard smirked. "That's what I thought. Back to the shadows, Carter. Clean your mess and leave my boardroom. You don't belong here." The laughter resumed, sharper this time, and Elijah lowered his head further, his vision blurring. His mop swished across the floor, soaking up the spill, but each stroke was a wound. Each ripple in the water reflected his humiliation back at him. And yet something strange happened. As he lifted the mop, Elijah's eyes caught the gleam of the table's polished surface. For just a moment, he saw his own reflection there. Tired, broken, yes, but still standing, still enduring. His chest tightened. His silence felt heavier than ever, pressing against him like a dam ready to break. He backed away slowly, pushing his cart toward the door, the echo of their laughter still clawing at him. But before he left, his eyes lingered on Richard Holloway. And though Elijah said nothing, the look in his eyes spoke volumes. A storm was coming. The door swung shut out behind him with a hollow thud, but the echoes of their laughter followed Elijah into the hallway like chains dragging at his ankles. He walked with the cart, every step heavier than the last, his breath shallow as if the air itself were too thick to breathe. For years he had endured their silence, the quiet exclusion, the invisible walls. But today was different. Today he had been seen, not as a man, not even as a worker, but as an object, paraded in front of the board like a joke. His face burned, his chest ached. He turned the corner and stopped, gripping the cart's handle as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He pressed his forehead to the cool wall, eyes squeezed shut. He thought of Lillian again, her hands cupping his face, her voice soothing, always reminding him he was worth more than the world admitted. But if she were here now, would she still believe it? The question tore at him. Down the corridor, voices carried. Executives spilled out of side offices, their conversations brisk, sharp. They passed Elijah without pause, their suits swaying, their cologne lingering in the air. Not one pair of eyes met his, not one nod, not one acknowledgement. He was once again invisible. Invisible. except when mocked. He tried to return to work, but his body betrayed him. His hands shook so badly the mop slipped from his grasp, clattering against the marble with a sound that rang out like a gunshot. Heads turned. A young intern glanced at him with something between pity and discomfort, then quickly looked away, as though ashamed to be caught seeing him. Elijah stooped, his knees stiff, picking up the mop. He gritted his teeth, forcing his body into motion, forcing the routine back into place. Mop, bucket, ring, repeat. The rhythm was familiar, mechanical, a shield against the storm in his chest. But no rhythm could erase Richard Holloway's voice. "Back to the shadows, Carter. You don't belong here." The words replayed in his mind, louder with each cycle, until they weren't just ords anymore. They were chains. They were bars. They were the weight of every injustice he had swallowed, every silent humiliation, every time he chose survival over dignity. Elijah moved to the wide glass wall overlooking the city. He paused, staring out at the sea of buildings bathed in sunlight. The city looked so alive from up here, so powerful, as if nothing beneath its surface ever cracked. But Elijah knew better. He knew that power was built on backs like his, the unseen, the unheard, the ones who scrubbed and carried and bent until their bodies gave out. And yet, the men in the boardroom would never know his name. He lifted a hand, pressing it to the glass. His palm left a faint print, a smudge against the perfection. He imagined leaving it there, a mark that could not be ignored, proof that he had been here, even if only as a shadow. Behind him, a voice cleared. "Elijah." He turned. It was Denise, another janitor, older than him, her grey curls tucked beneath a cap. She looked at him with gentle eyes, her mop slung over her shoulder. "You okay?" she asked softly. He forced a nod, though his throat was too tight for words. Denise stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I heard them. I heard what they said." She hesitated, her gaze sharp. "Don't let them break you, Eli. You've carried too much to let men like that decide your worth." Her words were kind, but they felt distant, like an echo from a world he no longer trusted. He managed a weak smile, the kind that convinced no one, and turned back to his cart. Denise lingered a moment longer, her face lined with quiet sorrow, then moved on. Elijah resumed his work, but each stroke of the mop was slower now, heavier, weighed down by the memory of that room. The building buzzed with life as morning unfolded. Meetings, phone calls, footsteps rushing down halls. The world moved, indifferent. Yet for Elijah, each time seemed to have frozen in that moment when Richard's words sliced him open. He had stepped into the boardroom for the first time, and in seconds, he had been cast out. Still, something about the way Holloway looked at him stayed in his mind. Not just disdain, but something else, something sharp, something unsettled. Elijah couldn't shake the thought. What if, for the first time, Richard Holloway had felt the presence of the man he had mocked? What if the shadow he tried to banish had left a mark? The thought clung to Elijah like the fading rumble of thunder after a storm. And deep inside, though buried under pain and humiliation, a seed of defiance stirred. He did not know it yet, but the storm had only just begun. The day stretched on in fragments, hours that felt longer than years. Elijah moved through the building like a shadow tethered to routine, but his thoughts remained trapped in the boardroom. He couldn't escape the sharp image of Richard Holloway leaning back in his chair, lips curled, eyes glinting with amusement, as the room laughed. By evening, the offices had begun to empty. Executives filed out in tailored suits, their polished shoes clicking on the marble he had polished. They did not notice Elijah pushing his cart along the hall. They never did. But when he reached the far end of the corridor, near the elevators, he heard the sound of voices again. The boardroom was still alive. Its doors were cracked open, spilling laughter into the hall. Elijah paused, his mop in hand, the cart wheels squeaking faintly. Inside, Richard's voice rose above the others. "Imagine the janitor trying to sit here, giving orders," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "He'd probably tell us to invest in mop stocks." The room erupted. Chairs creaked, hands slapped the table, laughter bounced off the polished wood. Elijah's stomach turned. He clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. His hands tightened around the mop handle until it felt as though the wood might splinter. He wanted to storm in, to demand they see him, to demand they understand that he was a man with blood and history, not an object. But he stayed rooted in place, hidden in the hall. The silence he had carried for decades held him down like chains. A memory struck him. Marcus, as a boy, once asking, "Daddy, why don't you ever speak up at work? Why don't they listen to you?" Elijah had crouched down, looked his son in the eye and said, "Because sometimes keeping quiet is how you survive." But what if survival was no longer enough? He turned abruptly, wheeling his cart away, his reflection flashing in the glass as he passed. His face looked harder now, lined with pain, but also something else. Resolve. Downstairs, in the dim janitor's lounge, he sat alone. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence. His sandwich lay untouched in its wrapper. He stared at his hands again, those hands that had built nothing the world valued, but had built everything he had left. "Enough," he whispered, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. He thought of Lillian's faith, of Marcus's lost belief, of Denise's kind warning. He thought of every night he had scrubbed marble while others trampled it. His silence had been survival, but now it felt like surrender. The storm outside had passed, but inside him it was only growing. Hours later, when the building emptied entirely, Elijah returned to the corridor outside the boardroom. The door stood closed, silent now. He placed his hand on it, palm flat against the cold wood. He stood like that for a long moment, his head bowed. "This isn't the end of me," he murmured. The words were quiet, but they rang in his chest like a bell tolling midnight. He let his hand fall, turning back toward his cart. The silence of the building pressed close around him, but for once it did not feel suffocating. It felt waiting. And Elijah knew that waiting would not last. Inside the boardroom, the men mocked him as though he were nothing. But life has a way of humbling power, of dragging arrogance to its knees. Elijah didn't know that within hours, Richard Holloway, the man who had laughed the loudest, would clutch his chest in agony, collapsing on the very marble Elijah had polished. He didn't know the storm would break open in ways none of them could control. But somehow, in the stillness of that night, Elijah felt it coming. The shadows on marble would not remain shadows forever. The next morning began like any other, though Elijah felt the air was different. Heavier, like the world was holding its breath. The tower rose against the pale sky, glass gleaming, indifferent to the lives it swallowed. Inside, executives hurried through the corridors, their footsteps sharp and urgent, their conversations clipped and cold. The hum of business carried on, as though nothing had ever shifted. For Elijah, though, everything had shifted. He moved with his cart, eyes lowered, but inside, the storm churned stronger than ever. He could still hear the laughter, still feel Richard Holloway's voice tearing into him, still taste the humiliation that clung like ash in his throat. And yet, beneath the weight of shame, a strange defiance stirred. The vow he'd whispered the night before, "This isn't the end of me," echoed through his chest. The boardroom was alive again. Through the frosted glass, Elijah could see shadows shifting, arms gesturing, heads nodding. He could hear fragments of sharp words: market, merger, profits, layoffs. It was the language of power, each word carrying more weight than his entire existence in their eyes. Elijah stopped near the door, his mop in hand. He told himself he would move on, that it was not his world. But something inside him resisted. He lingered, his body tense, as though waiting for something unseen. And then it happened. A sound that did not belong. At first it was just a pause, a hitch in the rhythm of voices. Then came a muffled groan, low and strange, cutting through the steady hum of business. Papers rustled, chairs scraped against the floor. "Elijah!" Someone called sharply from down the hall, but the voice wasn't speaking to him. It was panicked, directed inward. Through the glass, Elijah saw a figure stumble. The shadow of a man at the head of the table lurched forward, clutching his chest. The room erupted in chaos. Executives sprang from their seats, their voices cracking with fear. Richard Holloway. The Titan, the billionaire, the man whose words had carved scars into Elijah's soul, was collapsing. The door flung open, and Elijah was suddenly staring into the boardroom he had been banished from. Papers littered the table, coffee spilled across reports. And at the center of it all, Richard Holloway gasped for air, his face pale, his body trembling as he sank to the floor. The room froze for a moment, as if disbelief had paralyzed them all. Men and women who commanded empires, who shifted millions with a single signature, now stood helpless, their power stripped away in the face of mortality. "Call 911!" one executive shouted, fumbling with his phone. Another knelt by Richard, her hands hovering uselessly. Elijah stood at the threshold, heart pounding. His instincts screamed to turn away. This was the man who had mocked him, degraded him, reminded him of his place. Why should he step in now? But another voice whispered inside him, quiet but steady. Lillian's voice. A man's worth isn't measured by the cruelty of others. It's measured by what you choose to do. He looked at Richard, the man who had called him a shadow, and saw not a billionaire, not a tyrant, but a human being gasping for life. A man who, despite all his power, was just as fragile as anyone else. Elijah's hands shook. He could turn away. He could let the man who mocked him collapse into silence. But something deeper pulled him forward. His footsteps echoed across the marble as he stepped inside the boardroom. For the first time in 27 years, Elijah Carter crossed the threshold not as a shadow, but as a man walking into fire. All eyes turned to him. The executives who had laughed yesterday now stared in shock, their voices faltering. "What are you doing here?" one demanded, his tone more fear than disdain. But Elijah didn't answer. He knelt beside Richard Holloway, his mind racing, memories of Lillian flooding back. She had been a nurse, her hands steady, her voice calm in the face of crisis. He had watched her countless times, listened to her explain what to do if something like this ever happened. Now, her voice guided him. Check his pulse. Keep his airway open. Don't freeze. Elijah pressed his fingers to Richard's neck, feeling for a beat. It was faint, erratic. Richard's lips parted, gasping, his eyes rolling back. "Elijah." Richard's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with something that almost sounded like fear. The irony was sharp, almost cruel. The man who had stripped Elijah of dignity was now calling his name, clinging to life beneath his hands. Elijah leaned closer, his own breath shaking. "I've got you," he murmured. And as thunder rolled again outside, Elijah began to act. Elijah pressed down firmly, the rhythm of chest compressions rising and falling beneath his hands. The marble floor was cold beneath his knees, the air thick with panic, and disbelief. Around him, the boardroom, usually a theatre of power, had been stripped bare. No charts, no laughter, no authority mattered now. Only the fragile beat of a failing heart. "Don't just stand there," Elijah barked, his voice raw, surprising even himself. "Call the ambulance now." Executives scrambled, their phones shaking in their hands. One shouted into the receiver, stumbling over his words. Another hovered uselessly, biting her nails. Men who commanded millions daily stood paralyzed, their polished confidence shattered. But Elijah moved with clarity. His hands pressed, released, pressed again, the rhythm steady. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He counted under his breath. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. He tilted Richard's head back, pinched his nose, and breathed air into the man who had stolen his dignity. Richard coughed, a shallow rattling sound, then fell limp again. Elijah didn't stop. He pressed harder, the memory of Lillian's voice echoing through him. "Stay calm. Don't quit until help arrives. You're stronger than you think." Each push was more than survival. Each push was defiance. He remembered every insult, every laugh, every locked door. And now, those same men stood around him, their eyes wide, their world suddenly tilted. For the first time they saw Elijah. Not the janitor, not the shadow, but a man holding their leader's life in his hands. Richard's face was pale, sweat glistening at his temples. His expensive tie lay crumpled against the floor, his cufflinks askew. Power had been stripped from him, leaving only mortality, fragile and trembling. "Elijah, he's not breathing," a woman's voice cried, high-pitched, trembling. "I know," Elijah snapped, but his voice carried no fear, only urgency. He pressed again, harder, willing life back into the man's chest. The boardroom filled with the sound of his effort, the thump of compressions, the hiss of his breaths, the shallow gasps of Richard clinging to the edge. Outside, the storm gathered again, clouds rolling back in though the morning had seemed clear. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the city in brief, violent flashes. It was as if the world itself leaned closer to watch. Elijah's arms ached, his body screaming with fatigue, but he refused to stop. He thought of Marcus, his son, and how one day, maybe, Marcus would hear about this moment. Maybe he would know his father had not stayed silent forever, that he had stepped forward when no one else could. Richard's chest rose slightly, then fell again. Elijah's hands did not falter. Behind him, one of the executives whispered, "He knows what he's doing." The tone was hushed, reverent, as though they were witnessing something they could not comprehend. And perhaps they were. For decades, Elijah had been invisible to them. Now their survival, their entire empire's stability, hung on the man they had mocked. "Elijah," Richard croaked suddenly, his voice ragged, his eyes fluttering open for a second. It wasn't the voice of a king or a tyrant. It was the voice of a man afraid, small, desperate. Elijah looked at him, sweat dripping down his brow, and held his gaze for a brief moment. "I've got you," he repeated, steady, unshaken. The sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder, closer. Relief flickered across the faces around him, but Elijah didn't pause, didn't surrender his rhythm. He pressed, breathed, pressed again, his body moving like a machine driven by something greater than strength, by love, by memory, by rage, by resilience. And then Richard gasped. It was faint, jagged, but it was there, the sound of life clawing back into his lungs. His body jolted slightly, his hand twitching weakly on the marble. Elijah leaned closer, pressing his ear to Richard's mouth. Air. Shallow, broken, but real. "He's breathing," Elijah whispered, almost in disbelief. The boardroom erupted in gasps of relief, but no applause, no laughter. Only silence followed, heavy and raw, as though everyone present understood the magnitude of what had just unfolded. The storm outside cracked with thunder, rattling the glass walls, shaking the room as if punctuating the moment. Elijah leaned back, his hands trembling now, the adrenaline draining from his veins. He looked around the room at the faces staring at him. Not with mockery this time, but with something else. Respect, guilt, shame. The man they had banned from the boardroom had just saved it, and yet Elijah knew this was only the beginning, because Richard Holloway was still alive. And alive, he would have to face what had just happened. The sirens grew louder until they pierced the boardroom walls, urgent and relentless. Red and blue lights flashed against the glass exterior, staining the polished floor with streaks of color. Paramedics burst through the door within seconds, carrying their gear, their movements swift and precise. "Step back!" one ordered, kneeling where Elijah had been. Elijah obeyed, his arms heavy, his chest heaving. He stumbled back against the wall, sweat clinging to his shirt, his hands trembling with exhaustion. The boardroom seemed to spin around him, voices distant, muffled. For a moment, he felt as though he were watching from outside his own body. The paramedics worked quickly. Oxygen mask, monitors, injections. They moved with efficiency, but Elijah knew it was his hands, his choice not to walk away, that had kept Richard Holloway alive long enough to see this moment. The executives crowded close, their voices hushed, their eyes wide. Some glanced at Elijah, their faces pale with recognition. These were the same men and women who had laughed at him only hours ago. Now their laughter had curdled into silence. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a gold watch, approached Elijah. He hesitated, as though unsure how to speak to him. You saved him," he said, the words awkward, heavy, almost choking. Elijah didn't reply. His eyes remained fixed on Richard, watching the rise and fall of his chest beneath the oxygen mask. The paramedics lifted Richard onto a stretcher. His hand twitched weakly, fingers curling as though reaching for something unseen. His face was pale, drained of its usual arrogance. For the first time, Richard Holloway looked fragile, small, human. As they wheeled him toward the door, Ricky, Hard's eyes flickered open. They darted around the room, searching, until they found Elijah. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked. Richard's lips moved beneath the mask. No sound came, only the faint shape of Elijah's name. Elijah's chest tightened. He didn't move, didn't speak, but the message was clear. In his most desperate hour, Richard Holloway, the man who had called him a shadow, who had banned him from this very room, had reached for him. The doors closed behind the stretcher, leaving the boardroom in stunned silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. The executives stood in clusters, their faces pale, their voices swallowed. The hum of business, the clatter of keyboards, the shuffle of papers, all gone. Only the storm outside remained, its thunder rolling like an echo of everything that had just happened. Elijah stood at the center of it all, mop still leaning against the wall, his hands raw from compressions. He felt the weight of every gaze, but he did not bow his head this time. For the first time in 27 years, Elijah Carter was not invisible. The silence stretched until Denise appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked at Elijah, then at the stunned executives, then back again. A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "You see?" she said softly, though her voice carried. "He's always been more than what you thought." A ripple of shame crossed the room, heads lowered, eyes darted away. The men and women who had laughed hours ago now stood in the presence of a truth they could not unsee. Elijah met their silence with his own. He had no speech, no need for words. His actions had spoken louder than anything he could have said. He turned, gripping the handle of his cart. The mop bucket sloshed faintly as he wheeled it toward the door. The marble floor gleamed behind him, polished not just by labor, but by a moment that had cracked the facade of power itself. At the threshold, Elijah paused. He looked back once more at the boardroom, the room that had defined his invincibility, the room that had mocked him, the room where he had saved a life. The storm outside cracked with lightning, flooding the space with a blinding flash. In that moment, Elijah's shadow stretched across the boardroom table, long and undeniable, reaching the very seat where Richard Holloway had sat. Then he stepped out, leaving silence in his wake. The storm raged on, but Elijah Carter walked with a steadier stride. Something had shifted forever. And though the world didn't yet know it, the man they had tried to erase had just become the one they could never forget. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and rain-soaked clothes. The storm had chased Elijah all the way here, dripping from his jacket, clinging to his boots. He sat alone in the waiting room, his mop-scarred hands folded in his lap, calloused fingers trembling slightly with leftover adrenaline. He hadn't meant to follow. When the paramedics wheeled Richard Holloway out of the boardroom, Elijah had intended to disappear back into the marble shadows. But something stronger than habit had pulled him along, something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was unfinished business. Perhaps it was the weight of Richard's eyes meeting his, lips forming his name through the oxygen mask. Now the Empire's Titan lay in a sterile room just down the hall, machines humming where once his voice had roared, and Elijah sat in a chair with frayed upholstery, invisible again, unnoticed by the nurses who rushed past. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. His chest ached, but not from the effort of compressions. It was something deeper, heavier, a wound older than last night. He thought of Lillian again, of her hands guiding his through CPR practice in their tiny kitchen years ago, just in case. He had hated the drills back then. Now he realized she had prepared him for this moment, as if she had cuddled. Now and someday his silence would be broken not by words, but by action. Elijah Carter. The voice startled him. He looked up to see a woman in a navy suit, her expression tight with both exhaustion and worry. She carried a clipboard, but her eyes carried judgment, sharp and assessing. "Yes," Elijah said, his voice hoarse. "I'm Dr. Sanderson. Mr. Holloway is stable for now. He wouldn't be if you hadn't acted." She studied him for a moment, then added, "The board members told me what you did. They said you saved his life." Elijah looked down at his hands again. "I just did what I could." Her tone softened. "What you did mattered." She hesitated, then leaned closer. "He asked for you." The words struck Elijah like a blow. "Me?" She nodded. "Yes." He regained partial consciousness for a few minutes. He asked for Elijah Carter, the janitor. His exact words. Elijah's throat tightened. He didn't know whether to laugh or weep. After 27 years of invisibility, his name had been spoken in a place he never belonged. Dr. Sanderson gestured down the hall. "You can see him for a few minutes." Elijah rose slowly, his body heavy, as though the weight of years pressed down on him. His boots echoed softly on the linoleum floor as he followed her to the room. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. Richard Holloway lay in the hospital bed, pale and frail, a man stripped of the armor wealth and arrogance had built around him. The monitors beeped steadily, machines hissing with every breath that the oxygen helped him take. His hands twitched weakly against the sheets. For a moment, Elijah stood frozen in the doorway. He saw not the billionaire, not the tyrant, but a man cornered by mortality. And strangely, Elijah felt no triumph, only a heavy sorrow that settled deep in his bones. Richard's eyes opened slowly, finding Elijah across the room. They were not the cold, cutting eyes from the boardroom. They were the eyes of a man afraid. "Elijah." His voice was raspy, strained, but the name carried something it had never carried before: recognition. Elijah stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath his weight. He stopped at the side of the bed, looking down at the man who had called him less than human. "You saved me," Richard whispered. The words hung in the air, heavy and trembling. Elijah's jaw clenched. He thought of the laughter, of the jeers, of every locked door and every silence. His chest swelled with everything he could say, everything he had swallowed for decades. Yet when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I did what anyone would have done." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Not everyone would have stepped forward. Not everyone would have chosen compassion over vengeance. Richard's eyes filled with something Elijah had never seen in them before. Not power, not pride, but shame. And in that shame, Elijah saw the first crack in the marble facade of Richard Holloway. For a long while, Richard Holloway said nothing. The steady beep of the monitor filled the silence, marking each fragile heartbeat like a drum of mortality. His chest rose and fell beneath the thin hospital gown, each breath labored, rattling. He turned his head slightly, as though it cost him all his strength to look directly at Elijah. "I mocked you," Richard whispered finally, his voice breaking. "I shamed you. In front of everyone." His eyes flickered shut, as if he couldn't bear to see the truth of his own words. Elijah stood tall, his broad frame casting a shadow across the bed. He felt the weight of Richard's admission settle over him, not lightening, but deepening the ache in his chest. For years he had prayed for this, for Richard, for any of them, to finally see what their words had done. But now that the moment had come, it felt hollow. "Yes," Elijah said quietly, "you did." Richard flinched, as though the words themselves had pierced him. And still, "You saved me." "Why?" Elijah looked down at his hands, scarred and rough, the same hands that had scrubbed marble floors, carried a wife through sickness, held a son who no longer believed in. Hands that had pressed life back into the chest of a man who had stripped him of dignity. "Because life is life," Elijah said at last. "Because no one deserves to die alone on a floor they thought they owned." Richard's lips trembled. His eyes grew moist, and for the first time, Elijah saw tears gather in the corners. They didn't fall. Not yet. But the sheen of them was enough. "I've built an empire," Richard murmured, "but I've never felt this small." Elijah's gaze hardened. "Maybe small is what you needed to feel." The room went quiet again, the hum of the machine surrounding them like an invisible storm. Richard turned his head slightly away, ashamed. His voice dropped to a whisper, so faint Elijah had to lean closer. "I don't deserve your mercy." Elijah inhaled sharply, fighting the tide of anger that threatened to rise. He saw flashes in his mind: Richard's laughter, the boardroom's jeers, Marcus's disappointment, Lillian's quiet encouragement. He felt every humiliation, every scar, every night spent whispering to the woman who was no longer here. "You don't," Elijah said bluntly. Richard's eyes widened, darting back to him. For a moment, the mask of power flickered across his face again, but it was weak, fleeting, like a candle in the wind. "You don't deserve it," Elijah repeated, his voice steady but low. "But I didn't save you for you. I saved you for me. Because I won't let your cruelty turn me into something I'm not." Richard blinked, the tears threatening to spill at last. He swallowed hard, his throat working painfully. For a man who had always spoken like thunder, silence now seemed to crush him more than anything. A knock at the door broke the moment. Dr. Sanderson stepped in, her presence brisk but respectful. She glanced at Elijah, then at Richard. "Mr. Holloway, you need rest. We'll keep monitoring you through the night." She turned to Elijah. "5 more minutes." Elijah nodded, though his eyes stayed on Richard. Richard reached weakly for his hand. His fingers barely brushed Elijah's rough skin before falling back against the sheets. "Stay," he whispered, as though the word itself was heavier than all the wealth he carried. Elijah hesitated. The request dug deep, pulling at wounds both fresh and ancient. Part of him wanted to leave, to let Richard Holloway drown in his shame alone. But another part, the part Lillian had always nurtured, told him to remain, to bear witness. So he stayed. The minutes stretched, filled only by the rhythmic hum of machines and Richard's fragile breaths. Elijah stood like a sentinel at the edge of the bed, silent, unyielding. And in that silence, something extraordinary happened. The boardroom had silenced him for years. Richard had reduced him to a shadow. But here, in the quiet of this sterile room, Elijah's presence spoke louder than any word. When Dr. Sanderson returned to usher him out, Elijah finally stepped away. He paused at the doorway, turning back once more. Richard's eyes followed him, hollow but searching, as though trying to hold on to the one man who had seen him at his weakest. Elijah met his gaze, then spoke the truth Richard would carry long after the machines stopped humming. "A man's worth was never yours to measure." And with that, he left, his footsteps steady, his name now echoing in a place it had never reached before. The night pressed down heavy as Elijah stepped out of the hospital. The storm had finally broken, leaving the city washed and trembling, its streets slick with reflections of neon and rain. He paused under the awning, drawing in the sharp scent of wet asphalt, his chest rising and falling as if each breath had to battle its way free. He had not meant to linger at Richard Holloway's bedside, and yet he had. His name, Eli Jar Carter, had been spoken in that sterile room, not as a curse, not as a joke, but as a plea. For the first time, it had mattered, and still, Elijah felt no victory, no triumph, only the deep ache of wounds reopening, old and new. He walked down the block, hands buried in his jacket pockets, the city's hum filling the silence. Cars hissed through puddles, horns blared, and life went on, indifferent. But inside Elijah, something had shifted forever. When he returned to the tower the next day, whispers clung to the walls like smoke. Executives passed by with lowered voices, casting sidelong glances at him. Some nodded faintly, others looked away in shame. No one laughed. Not this time. Denise found him in the janitor's closet, coiling up cords with steady hands. She leaned against the doorway, her eyes sharp but kind. "You've got them rattled," she said. Elijah looked up, surprised. "Me?" She nodded. "You. The man they never saw. Now the only one they can't stop talking about." He shook his head. "They'll forget soon enough. They always do." "Maybe," Denise admitted, stepping inside. "But maybe not. Maybe this time they'll remember. You left your mark, Eli. Don't sell yourself short." Her words lingered long after she left. Elijah turned them over in his mind as he pushed his cart down the hall. For years he had begged silently to be seen, to be acknowledged. And now, in the strangest of ways, the world had shifted. His name had echoed through the boardroom and the hospital alike. And yet, Elijah wasn't sure if he wanted their respect. Respect born of crisis was a fragile thing. What he wanted was something deeper. Not their pity, not their shame, but truth. That night, as he polished the marble floor outside the boardroom once again, Elijah stopped mid-stroke. He straightened, staring at his own reflection rippling faintly in the glossy surface. He saw the tired man, the scarred hands, the lined face. But he also saw something else. Endurance. Presence. A man who had stepped forward when the world expected him to shrink. The boardroom doors remained closed, but the sound inside was subdued now. No laughter, no cruel jeers, just murmurs, low and careful. The silence on the other side was different. Not the silence of arrogance, but the silence of shame. Elijah leaned on the mop handle, his shoulders heavy, but his spirit steadier. He whispered into the empty hall, not to Lillian this time, not to God, but to himself. "They know my name." The words were small, almost lost in the hum of the air vents, but they carried weight. They were an anchor, proof that invisibility was not his destiny. Behind the door, Richard Holloway lay in a hospital bed, facing a shame far heavier than any wealth could shield him from. And beyond those doors, beyond the marble and glass, Elijah Carter walked in the quiet knowledge that his worth had never depended on a boardroom's approval. The night deepened, shadows stretching long across the polished floor. But Elijah no longer felt like a shadow himself. He felt solid, present, undeniable. And though the future remained uncertain, one truth pulsed through him, as steady as the heart he had helped save. His name would not be forgotten. Not anymore. Richard Holloway had built his empire on noise, the noise of ringing phones, of boardroom applause, of his own booming voice filling every corner like thunder. But now, lying in a hospital bed, his empire was silent. The monitors beeped steadily, the oxygen hissed in rhythm, but none of it belonged to him. For the first time in decades, Richard Holloway had no control. He stared at the ceiling, the pale light washing his face in sterile shadows. Shame pressed down on him harder than the weight of his failing heart. The memory of Elijah's hands on his chest, of Elijah's voice steadying the chaos, of Elijah's eyes holding his when no one else dared. It replayed endlessly, burning deeper than any pain. He had mocked the man, reduced him to nothing, and that man had given him life. When the door opened, Richard flinched, half expecting another doctor, another clipboard, another reminder of his frailty. But instead, it was a face he hadn't expected to see. Marcus Carter. The young man stood stiff in the doorway, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp with distrust. He looked like Elijah, the same proud posture, the same fire hidden beneath quiet restraint. But where Elijah's eyes carried years of silence, Marcus's carried rage, unspent. "I heard what happened," Marcus said, his voice low, clipped. "You humiliated my father. You made him a joke in front of your empire." Richard swallowed hard. The shame in his chest grew heavier. No." Marcus's voice cracked like a whip. He stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Don't you dare try to explain. My father gave his life to that building, 27 years, and you treated him like dirt under your shoes." Richard's lips trembled. He had faced investors, rivals, even politicians without fear. But this young man's anger cut through him like a blade. Marcus leaned closer. "And still, he saved you." His voice broke slightly on the last word. "Do you know what that means? Do you have any idea the kind of man you spat on?" Richard closed his eyes, the weight of the truth crushing him. "I know," he whispered. "I know now." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the beep of the monitor. Marcus's chest rose and fell with fury, his nostrils flaring, but his eyes glistened with something else. Pain. "My mom used to tell me my dad was a hero," Marcus said, his voice softer now, trembling. "But I stopped believing it. I saw the way the world treated him. the way men like you looked through him. I thought, maybe she was wrong. Maybe he really was just invisible." He swallowed hard. "But last night he proved her right." Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words stuck like thorns. What apology could erase decades of cruelty? What words could undo the laughter that had stabbed through Elijah's silence? Marcus straightened, his eyes narrowing. "He doesn't need your apology. He doesn't need your respect. He's already more of a man than you'll ever be." The words landed like blows, each one stripping Richard further of the armor he had spent a lifetime forging. He nodded weakly, tears stinging his eyes. Marcus turned to leave, his steps sharp, decisive. But at the door, he paused. His voice dropped low, heavy with warning. "Remember his name. Elijah Carter. Because the rest of us will." And then he was gone, the door closing with a soft click. Richard lay there trembling, the silence pressing tighter. Elijah Carter. The name echoed in his mind, louder than any boardroom applause, sharper than any deal struck. A name that would not let him rest, a name that would not fade. For the first time in his life, Richard Holloway felt not like a king, not like a giant, but like a man brought to his knees by the weight of another man's dignity. The hospital room remained quiet long after Marcus's footsteps faded down the corridor. Richard lay staring at the ceiling, every word the young man had spoken still cutting through him like glass. Remember his name. Elijah Carter. It was strange. For years, Richard had lived among names that moved mountains, investors, politicians, magnates, names etched into buildings, names whispered in markets across continents, and yet none of those names weighed on him now, only Elijah's. He turned his head slightly, wincing at the ache in his chest. Through the small window, he could see the city skyline glimmering in the dark, indifferent and immense. He had thought himself part of that skyline, a permanent fixture, untouchable. But now, lying frail and broken, he understood. Odd how fragile even the highest towers could be. He whispered the name again, tasting it like confession. Elijah Carter. In another part of the city, Elijah sat in his modest apartment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Marcus had come by earlier, his words clipped but urgent. They had argued. Marcus, fierce with pride and anger. Elijah, weary with the exhaustion of carrying both silence and shame. "You don't get it, Dad," Marcus had said, pacing the narrow kitchen. "You proved them wrong. You showed them who you are. Why are you still acting like you're small?" Elijah had leaned against the counter, his hands folded, his voice soft. "Because, son, one moment doesn't erase 27 years. But when Marcus left, Elijah sat for hours replaying it all. Richard's collapse, the frantic boardroom, the paramedics, the hospital. He saw again the look in Richard's eyes as he whispered his name. Not mockery, not disdain. Something closer to reverence, something closer to guilt. Elijah rubbed his temples, his chest heavy. He thought of Lillian again, her voice steady, her faith unshakable. The truth doesn't need permission, Eli. It just needs courage. He wondered if this was what she had meant. Not some grand speech, not some rebellion, but simply standing firm when the world tried to erase him. The next morning, when Elijah entered the tower again, the atmosphere was different. Conversations hushed as he passed. Secretaries glanced up from their desks, their expressions unreadable. Executives avoided his eyes, their polished shoes clicking faster against the marble. The building felt altered, as though overnight it had begun to recognize the presence of the man it had ignored. Denise joined him in the corridor, her mop slung over her shoulder. "They're talking about you," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Every last one of them." Elijah sighed. "Let them talk. They're not laughing anymore." He glanced at her, but she was already walking ahead, her beaky back straight, her steps steady. Elijah pushed his cart, his reflection rippling across the marble floor. For the first time, he didn't feel like a shadow. Meanwhile, Richard's empire trembled without him. The board convened, their voices hushed, their decisions fractured. Investors panicked. Reporters circled. And through it all, one name kept surfacing. Not Richard Holloway's, but Elijah Carter's. The story of the janitor who saved the billionaire spread in whispers, each telling, reshaping the balance of power. In his hospital bed, Richard demanded news. "What are they saying?" he asked his assistant, his voice still weak. They're talking about Elijah, sir. About what he did." The assistant hesitated. "Some say it's the most human thing that's ever happened in this company." Richard closed his eyes, the shame pressing deeper. For decades he had measured worth in profits and power. And now the empire he had built was whispering the name of the man he had tried to erase. It was unbearable. And yet somehow it was right. As the days passed, Richard's body slowly healed, but his spirit wrestled with something far heavier. Shame gnawed at him, relentless. The image of Elijah's hands, steady and strong, haunted his sleep. The echo of Marcus's voice, "He's already more of a man than you'll ever be," tore at him. And in the silence of long nights, Richard Holloway wept. Not for his failing heart, but for the years he had wasted blinded by arrogance, deaf to dignity. He knew he would have to face Elijah again. And when he did, he would not ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness was not his to claim. He would ask for truth. It was a week before Richard Holloway returned to the tower. He entered not through the grand lobby, flanked by photographers, but quietly through a side entrance, his steps slower, his face thinner. He wore no suit today, only a plain jacket, as though the armor of wealth no longer fit him. Word spread quickly. The CEO was back. Executives scrambled. Whispers followed him down the hall. But Richard ignored them all. His destination was not the boardroom, not the office that bore his name, but the marble corridor where Elijah Carter worked. Elijah was there, as always, mop in hand, his broad shoulders bent over the polished floor, the same rhythm, the same silence. Yet when Richard saw him now, it felt as though the world tilted. "Elijah," Richard said softly. The mop stopped mid-stroke. Elijah straightened slowly, turning to face him. His eyes were steady, unreadable. He didn't bow, didn't avert his gaze. He simply looked at Richard as a man looks at another man. Equal, unflinching. "I owe you my life," Richard began, his voice low, stripped of thunder. "But more than that, I owe you truth." Elijah said nothing. The silence between them stretched, thick with everything unsaid. Richard swallowed hard. "I mocked you. I made you a shadow in a place where you kept the light shining. I thought power meant worth, but in that moment on that floor, I saw the truth. You carried more dignity in your silence than I've ever had in all my noise." Elijah's jaw tightened, but his eyes did not soften. "And now you want forgiveness?" Richard shook his head slowly. "No, I don't deserve it. I only want you to know. I see you now. I should have seen you long ago." His voice cracked. "A man's worth was never mine to measure." The words hung in the hall, echoing faintly against the marble. For a long moment, Elijah stood still, his hands resting on the mop handle. Memories flickered through him, the laughter, the insults, the locked boardroom doors. He felt the old ache rise in his chest, but with it came something else. Release. "I didn't save you for you," Elijah said finally, his voice steady. "I saved you because of who I am, because my wife believed in mercy, because my son deserved to see his father stand tall. I don't need your apology, Richard. I don't need your shame. I just needed you to remember that." Richard's eyes filled, tears spilling down his cheeks unchecked. For the first time, he did not wipe them away. He let the shame, the grief, the truth wash him clean. Elijah turned back to his mop, pressing it against the marble once more. The rhythm resumed, steady and strong. But something had shifted. The man who had once been invisible now cast a shadow too large to ignore. Executives passed, their eyes darting between the two men. Whispers spread, but this time no laughter followed. Only silence. Heavy, reverent. Richard stepped back, his shoulders bowed. He knew he could not undo the past, but perhaps he could let it change him. As Elijah worked, the storm outside cleared. Sunlight spilled through the glass walls, flooding the marble with warmth. His reflection shone bright now, not distorted, not fractured, but whole. He whispered into the silence, just loud enough for himself. "They know my name." And for the first time it didn't sound like a dream. It sounded like truth. Richard Holloway turned, walking away, the echo of Elijah Carter's name following him like a haunting, like a promise. And Elijah. Elijah stood taller, his hands steady, his silence no longer a burden, but a crown. The man they tried to erase had become the man they could never forget.